You won't believe these historical figures were actually photographed. Did you know that some of history's most legendary figures, people you've only seen in paintings or read about in textbooks, were actually photographed in their final years? While our first video explored icons like John Quincy Adams and Harriet Tubman, we've uncovered even more astonishing photographs that connect us directly to our distant past. For centuries, humanity could only imagine the true faces of history's giants through subjective artistic interpretations. But a handful of revolutionary figures, innovators, and cultural icons lived just long enough to have their authentic likenesses captured by early cameras. These aren't artistic renderings or AI recreations, they're actual photographs of people who shaped our world, many born in the 1700s when America was still a British colony. The photographic evidence we're about to reveal will forever change how you visualize these historical legends. But here's what makes these photographs truly mind-blowing. Many of these historical giants appeared completely different in real life than the idealized images we've accepted for generations. Some were far more human and vulnerable than their heroic paintings suggest, while others possessed a striking charisma that even the finest portrait artists failed to capture. And perhaps most surprising of all, several of these photographs were deliberately suppressed or hidden away for decades because they contradicted the carefully crafted public images these figures or their estates wanted to maintain. When you see the actual faces of these world-changing individuals, not as artists imagined them, but as they truly appeared, you'll understand history in a profoundly different way. These rare visual time capsules don't just show us what these legends looked like, they reveal who they really were. So what happens when we strip away artistic interpretation and look directly at the authentic faces of history's most influential figures? Let's explore 16 more astonishing historical figures who lived just long enough to be photographed and discover what these remarkable images reveal about the real people behind the legends. 1. Edgar Allan Poe, the tormented genius captured. When we think of Edgar Allan Poe, most of us picture the somber, brooding figure from familiar paintings, the high forehead, the dark, intense eyes, the slightly disheveled appearance of a tortured artist. But in 1848, just a year before his mysterious death at age 40, Poe sat for a daguerreotype that gives us something no painting ever could, the authentic gaze of America's master of the macabre. Born in 1809, Poe created some of literature's most enduring works of horror and mystery, from The Raven to The Telltale Heart. What makes his photograph so remarkable is how it captures not just his appearance, but seems to reveal his psychological state during one of the most difficult periods of his troubled life. The daguerreotype, known as the Annie daguerreotype, named for the copy he gave to Annie Richmond, shows Poe with his characteristic widow's peak and mustache. But what's most striking are his eyes, penetrating, intense, and tinged with what appears to be profound melancholy. This isn't the romanticized sadness of artistic renderings, but the actual face of a man battling alcoholism, grief over his wife's death, and the financial struggles that plagued him throughout his career. Photography historian Tyler Anbinder noted, "What's remarkable about Poe's daguerreotype is how it seems to confirm what we know of his psychological state. This isn't an artist's interpretation, it's the unfiltered reality of a genius in decline." The timing of this photograph is particularly poignant. Taken in what would be the penultimate year of his life, it captures Poe after he had already written most of the works for which he's now famous, but before he received the widespread recognition his talent deserved. When we look into Poe's eyes in this image, we're seeing the actual face of the man who revolutionized American literature, not as we imagined him, but as he truly was in his final years. 2. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the revolutionary they tried to forget. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, born in 1815, was one of the most radical and influential advocates for women's rights in American history, while her collaborator Susan B. Anthony has become the more recognized face of the early women's movement. Stanton was often the intellectual force behind their shared activism. The earliest known photograph of Stanton dates to around 1850, when she was in her mid-30s and already deeply involved in the fight for women's rights. She had organized the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention in America, just 2 years earlier in 1848. What's particularly fascinating about Stanton's photographs is how they reveal a woman who defied the demure, self-effacing ideal of 19th century womanhood. In her portraits, Stanton looks directly at the camera with unmistakable confidence and determination. Unlike painted portraits of women from this era, which often softened features and emphasized conventional beauty, the camera captures Stanton Stanton's intellectual power and commanding presence. Later photographs showing Stanton in her elder years with her trademark white hair reveal something paintings could never convey: the physical manifestation of decades of struggle against entrenched opposition. These images show a woman who continued her radical advocacy well into her 80s, writing the Woman's Bible at age 80 to challenge religious justifications for women's subordination. What many people don't realize is that Stanton was deliberately marginalized in historical accounts of the suffrage movement because her views were considered too radical, even by fellow activists. While she fought for women's voting rights, she also advocated for divorce reform, reproductive rights, and religious reform, positions that were extraordinarily controversial in the 19th century. The photographs of Stanton provide us with unfiltered documentation of a revolutionary thinker who challenged virtually every aspect of women's status in society. When we look at these images, we're seeing the actual face of a woman whose ideas were so progressive that many wouldn't be widely accepted until more than a century after her death. 3. Samuel Morse, the painter who connected the world. Most people know Samuel F.B. Morse as the inventor of the telegraph and Morse code, but few realize he was initially a prominent painter before turning to invention. Even fewer know that Morse played a crucial role in bringing photography to America, creating a fascinating historical connection between the man and the medium that would preserve his image. Born in 1791, Morse was already in his late 40s when photography was invented. In 1839, upon hearing about Daguerre's invention, Morse traveled to Paris to meet the inventor. Impressed by what he saw, Morse returned to America and established one of the first photographic studios in New York City. The earliest photographs of Morse himself date from the 1840s, when he was in his 50s and at the height of his fame as the inventor of the telegraph. These images show a distinguished man with a high forehead and intense eyes, the face of someone whose innovations would transform global communication. What makes Morse's photographs particularly significant is this remarkable historical convergence. The man who created a system for instantaneously communicating across vast distances, the telegraph, also helped introduce a technology that would freeze moments in time: photography. Both inventions fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with time and space. Even more fascinating is that before becoming an inventor, Morse had been one of America's leading portrait painters. His transition from creating hand-painted portraits to promoting a mechanical means of capturing likenesses represents a pivotal moment in visual history, when technology began to replace artistry as the primary means of recording human appearance. When we look at photographs of Samuel Morse, we're not just seeing the face of a great inventor. We're seeing a man who stood at the crossroads of art and technology, whose life's journey reflected the broader transformation of how humans communicate and preserve images of themselves. 4. Victor Hugo, the literary giant's haunting gaze. Victor Hugo, born in 1802, created some of literature's most enduring characters in works like Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. While readers across generations have imagined the face behind these masterpieces, photography allows us to look directly into the eyes of the man who created Jean Valjean, Quasimodo, and Inspector Javert. Hugo was photographed numerous times throughout the latter part of his life, with some of the most striking images taken during his exile from France between 1851 and 1870. These photographs reveal a man with intense, penetrating eyes and an imposing presence that matches the power of his literary vision. What makes Hugo's photographs particularly fascinating is how they capture his transformation from a relatively conventional-looking writer in middle age to the almost mythic, white-bearded sage of his later years. This evolution wasn't just physical, but reflected Hugo's journey from successful establishment author to political exile and eventually to revered national icon. One of the most remarkable photographs shows Hugo on his deathbed in 1885. This haunting image, capturing the final moments of one of literature's greatest figures, provides a poignant reminder of the mortality of even the most towering creative geniuses. The photograph stands in stark contrast to the idealized, glorified paintings of deceased luminaries that were common before photography's invention. Hugo himself was fascinated by photography, experimenting with the medium and even creating his own photographic compositions. He recognized early on that photography represented a democratic revolution in visual representation, making portraiture, previously available only to the wealthy, accessible to ordinary people. When we look at photographs of Victor Hugo, particularly those showing him in his elder years with his iconic white beard and intense gaze, we're seeing the actual face of a literary colossus whose works continue to move readers nearly 2 centuries after they were written. The camera reveals what no painting could capture: the weathered humanity of a man whose imagination created worlds that continue to captivate us today. 5. General William Tecumseh Sherman, the General's Haunted Eyes. General William Tecumseh Sherman, born in 1820, is remembered for his March to the Sea during the Civil War, a military campaign that pioneered the strategy of total war and helped bring the Confederacy to its knees. While paintings and engravings of Sherman typically emphasize his military bearing and authority, photographs reveal something far more complex and human. Matthew Brady and his associates photographed Sherman multiple times during and after the Civil War. What's striking about these images is how they capture something no painting could convey. The psychological toll of war etched into Sherman's face. His penetrating gaze, deeply lined features, and the tension evident in his expression suggest a man who had witnessed terrible suffering. In one particularly famous photograph taken circa 1865, Sherman sits in his uniform, looking directly at the camera with an intensity that seems to pierce through time. General Ulysses S. Grant reportedly said of Sherman, "His eyes are the eyes of a prophet. They seem to see into the future." The camera captured this quality in a way no painter could replicate. What makes these photographs especially significant is how they reveal the humanity behind the controversial military strategist. Sherman famously declared, "War is hell," and in his photographs, we can see that this wasn't merely a pithy quote, but a reflection of his lived experience. The man who devised tactics that brought unprecedented destruction to the American South appears in these images not as a triumphant conqueror, but as someone marked by the very destruction he unleashed. Photography's unforgiving lens also documents Sherman's distinctive appearance. His receding hairline, unkempt beard, and wrinkled brow became instantly recognizable to the American public through widely circulated photographs. This visual familiarity helped make Sherman one of the first military figures to be widely recognized by ordinary citizens who had never seen him in person. When we look at photographs of William Tecumseh Sherman, we're seeing not just a historical figure, but the actual face of a man who transformed modern warfare. The camera captures not only his appearance, but hints of the psychological complexity of someone who both created tremendous suffering and sought to end a devastating war. 6. Clara Barton, the Angel of the Battlefield. Clara Barton, born in 1821, founded the American Red Cross and revolutionized battlefield medicine during the Civil War. While her name is familiar to many Americans, her actual appearance remains less known, yet photography allows us to see the real face of this pioneering humanitarian. The earliest photographs of Barton date from the Civil War period, when she was in her 40s and actively working to aid wounded soldiers. These images show a woman with a direct gaze and determined expression, qualities that helped her overcome the significant gender barriers of her era to provide crucial medical care on battlefields where women were typically unwelcome. What's particularly striking about Barton's photographs is how they contrast with the romanticized Angel of Mercy imagery that often surrounded female nurses in artistic depictions. The camera shows us not a delicate, ethereal figure, but a practical, resolute woman whose strength of character is evident in her steady gaze and composed demeanor. Later photographs showing Barton in her elder years as the established leader of the American Red Cross reveal something paintings could never capture: the physical embodiment of decades of determined service. These images show a woman who continued her humanitarian work well into her 80s, with a face marked by experience, but eyes still showing the same determination visible in her earlier portraits. Photography historian Martha Sandweiss noted, "What's remarkable about Barton's photographs is how they document a woman who created her own path in a time of rigid gender restrictions. The camera captures her practical determination rather than conformity to feminine ideals of the era." The photographs of Clara Barton provide us with unfiltered documentation of a pioneer who transformed disaster response and battlefield medicine. When we look at these images, we're seeing the actual face of a woman who risked her life repeatedly to aid others and who built an organization that continues to provide vital humanitarian services worldwide. 7. Geronimo, the warrior's defiant dignity. Geronimo, the renowned Apache leader born around 1829, was one of the last major Native American resistance leaders. After his surrender to U.S. forces in 1886, he became something of a celebrity, with his image captured in numerous photographs during the final years of his life. These photographs present a striking contrast to the demonized depictions of Geronimo that appeared in newspaper illustrations during the years when he actively fought against U.S. expansion. Instead of the savage warrior of popular imagination, the camera camera reveals a man of remarkable dignity and presence. What makes these images particularly significant is how they document the complex final chapter of Geronimo's life. After surrendering, he was held as a prisoner of war for decades, during which time he was both exhibited as a conquered enemy and celebrated as a living symbol of the vanishing frontier. He appeared at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis and rode in Theodore Roosevelt's 1905 inaugural parade. Photographs from this period show Geronimo in various contexts, sometimes in traditional Apache dress, other times in Western clothing, occasionally even wearing a top hat. This visual record documents the cultural limbo in which he existed during his final years, neither fully allowed to live according to Apache traditions nor fully accepted into American society. One of the most powerful photographs shows Geronimo in traditional dress, staring directly into the camera with an intensity that communicates across more than a century. The image captures not just his appearance, but conveys something of his indomitable spirit, a quality that made him a legendary military leader who, with a small band of fighters, successfully evaded thousands of U.S. and Mexican troops for years. Photography's honest documentation also reveals something often missing from romanticized modern depictions of Native American leaders: the physical toll of Geronimo's extraordinarily difficult life. His deeply lined face and weathered appearance testify to decades of struggle, warfare, and ultimately captivity. When we look at photographs of Geronimo, we're seeing the actual face of a man who witnessed the near-total destruction of his people's way of life. These images provide a direct connection to one of the most significant and tragic periods in American history, the final conquest of indigenous peoples and their lands. As remarkable as these photographic connections to the past are, they become even more astonishing when we consider figures from even earlier periods. The following historical giants were born in the 1700s, when America was still a British colony and the French Revolution hadn't yet occurred. Their photographs create an almost unbelievable bridge to a world that otherwise seems impossibly distant. 8. Dolly Madison, America's first Lady in all but name. Dolly Madison, born in 1768, served as First Lady during her husband James Madison's presidency, 1809 to 1817, and is credited with defining the role of the president's wife in American political life. What many people don't realize is that she lived long enough to be photographed, creating a direct visual link to the earliest days of the American Republic. The most notable photograph of Dolly Madison was taken around 1848, when she was about 80 years old. This daguerreotype shows an elderly woman with a lace cap covering her hair, seated and looking slightly away from the camera. The actual face of a woman who had personally known George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and the other founding fathers. What makes this photograph particularly remarkable is the historical span it represents. Dolly Madison was not just present for, but played an active role in the formative years of the United States. During the War of 1812, she famously saved Gilbert Stuart's portrait of Washington and other valuables before British troops burned the White House. The woman in this photograph personally rescued the iconic image of Washington that we still recognize today. The daguerreotype reveals something no painting could capture: the dignified elder years of a woman who had been the social and political partner of a founding father. Unlike the glamorous, youthful portraits painted during her time as First Lady, the photograph shows the natural effects of age, humanizing a figure who had attained almost legendary status in American history. Dolly Madison was known for her social skills and political acumen, using her position to help her husband build political coalitions during a politically divisive era. The photograph, taken more than 3 decades after she left the White House, shows a woman who remained socially connected and respected in Washington society until her death. When we look at this daguerreotype, we're seeing the actual face of a woman who helped establish many of the social traditions that would define the American presidency. This isn't an artist's interpretation, but the unfiltered reality of someone born when America was still fighting for its independence. 9. Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette, the hero of two worlds. The Marquis de Lafayette, born in 1757, was already a historical legend when photography was invented. A French aristocrat who fought for American independence, became a close friend of George Washington, and later played a key role in the French Revolution. Lafayette quite literally helped create the modern democratic world. The daguerreotype of Lafayette was taken in 1841 in Paris, just 2 years after the process was invented and when Lafayette was in his mid-80s. This makes it one of the earliest photographs of a major historical figure and certainly the earliest of anyone who played a significant role in the American Revolution. What makes this image particularly astonishing is the historical connections it represents. The elderly man in this photograph personally fought alongside George Washington, dined with Thomas Jefferson, and knew Benjamin Franklin. He wasn't just present for historical historic events. He helped shape them on 2 continents. Photography's unforgiving lens reveals something no painted portrait could convey: the physical toll of Lafayette's extraordinary life. The deeply lined face and frail appearance captured in the daguerreotype testify to decades of revolutionary struggle, imprisonment, and political upheaval that marked his long career. Lafayette's life spanned remarkable changes in both American and French history. He had been a major general in the Continental Army during the American Revolution, survived the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution, and lived to see the rise and fall of Napoleon. By the time this photograph was taken, Lafayette had witnessed the birth of 2 republics and the transformation of the Western political landscape. When we look at this daguerreotype, we're seeing a direct connection to the founding era of the United States. A man who personally knew and fought alongside Washington, who attended Jefferson's dinners, and who helped birth 2 nations. This isn't just a photograph. It's a time portal to the American Revolution and the birth of modern democracy. 10. Louise Marie-Thérèse Bathilde d'Orléans, the Duchess who survived the Terror. Born in 1750, the Duchess of Bourbon was a member of the French royal family who witnessed the entire arc of the French Revolution, from the Ancien Regime through the Terror, and eventually to the restoration of the monarchy. Remarkably, she lived long enough to be photographed in her final years, creating an astonishing visual connection to pre-revolutionary France. The daguerreotype of the Duchess, taken around 1841 to 1842, when she was in her early 90s, shows an elderly woman in the elaborate lace cap, typical of aristocratic women of her generation. What makes this image particularly extraordinary is that it captures someone born during the reign of Louis XV, who was a princess of the blood royal in the court of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The woman in this photograph personally experienced the fall of the French monarchy, was imprisoned during the Terror, and lived to see the restoration of the monarchy and its subsequent replacement by the July monarchy. Her life spanned from the height of the Ancien Regime to the dawn of the photographic era, a truly remarkable historical trajectory. Photography's honest documentation reveals something often missing from the ornate, flattering portraits of aristocrats from her youth: the humanity and vulnerability of even the most privileged figures. The elderly woman captured by the camera bears little resemblance to the idealized portraits of her youth, providing a poignant reminder of the passage of time and the equalizing effects of age. The Duchess had family connections to virtually every royal house in Europe and was related to both Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette. Unlike them, she survived the revolution, though she was imprisoned and lost many family members to the guillotine. The woman in this photograph lived through one of history's most dramatic political transformations, from absolute monarchy to modern republican government. When we look at this daguerreotype, we're seeing a direct visual connection to the court of Versailles in its final days. A woman who moved through the same spaces as Marie Antoinette and witnessed firsthand the opulence and subsequent collapse of the French aristocracy. This image quite literally connects us to a world that otherwise exists only in paintings and historical accounts. 11. Conrad Heyer, the revolutionary who crossed the Delaware. Conrad Heyer, born in 1749, holds the distinction of being the earliest born American known to be photographed. A Revolutionary War veteran, Heyer was captured in a daguerreotype in 1852 when he was approximately 103 years old. What makes this image truly extraordinary is Heyer's personal connection to one of the most iconic moments in American history. He was reportedly among the soldiers who crossed the Delaware River with George Washington during the American Revolution in December 1776. The elderly man in this photograph wasn't just alive during the Revolution. He was an active participant in one of its most celebrated military maneuvers. The daguerreotype shows a profoundly aged man with a deeply lined face and wispy white hair, the physical embodiment of the enormous historical distance between the Revolutionary era and the early days of photography. Born when America was still a British colony, Heyer lived to see the United States grow from 13 colonies to 31 states. Photography's unforgiving lens captures something no painting or written description could convey: the sheer longevity and physical resilience required to survive from the colonial era into the age of daguerreotypes. Unlike the idealized heroic depictions of revolutionary soldiers in historical paintings, this image shows the humble reality of an ordinary man who participated in extraordinary events. Heyer's life spanned remarkable transformations in American society. Born in the German immigrant community of Waldoboro, Maine, then part of Massachusetts, he lived through the entire founding era of the United States, the War of 1812, and into the growing sectional tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The centenarian in this photograph had personal memories of George Washington and lived to see the presidency of Millard Fillmore. When we look at this daguerreotype, we're seeing perhaps the most direct visual connection possible to the Revolutionary War, the actual face of a man who fought for American independence 3/4 of a century before his photograph was taken. This image doesn't just document an extremely elderly individual, it creates a bridge across time to the very founding of the United States. 12. John Tyler, the President. No one remembers. John Tyler, born in 1790, was the 10th President of the United States, taking office in 1841 after the death of William Henry Harrison. While Tyler's presidency is often overlooked in popular historical memory, his photographs provide a remarkable visual connection to the earliest days of the American Republic. Several daguerreotypes of Tyler exist, taken in the 1840s and early 1850s, showing a distinguished-looking man with a high forehead and the dignified bearing typical of statesmen of his era. What makes these images particularly significant is Tyler's unique historical position. He was the first vice president to succeed to the presidency upon the death of a president, establishing a precedent that would become the 25th Amendment more than a century later. What many people don't realize about Tyler is the extraordinary historical span his life represents. His father, Judge John Tyler Sr., had been a college roommate of Thomas Jefferson and a friend of Patrick Henry. Tyler himself was born during George Washington's presidency and lived to see the beginning of the Civil War. In fact, he died in 1862 as a member of the Confederate Congress, having turned against the Union he once led. Photography's honest documentation reveals something often missing from the formal portraits of presidents: the humanity behind the office. Unlike the somewhat stiff, idealized paintings of earlier presidents, Tyler's photographs capture subtle details of his appearance and bearing that help us see him as a real person rather than a remote historical figure. Perhaps most remarkably, Tyler's grandsons were still alive well into the 21st century. Lyon Gardner Tyler Jr. died in 2020 at age 95, and Harrison Ruffin Tyler was still living as of 2022. This means that just 3 generations of the Tyler family spanned from the founding era of the United States to the present day, an extraordinary compression of American history made possible by John Tyler fathering children in his 70s. When we look at daguerreotypes of John Tyler, we're seeing a direct visual connection to the earliest days of the American presidency. A man born when the United States was a new fragile nation of just 13 states, who lived to see it expand across the continent and then begin to tear itself apart in civil war. These images quite literally connect us to America's founding generation. 13. Lorenzo da Ponte, Mozart's librettist in America. Lorenzo da Ponte, born in 1749, had already lived an extraordinary life before photography was invented. As Mozart's librettist, he wrote the words for The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte, some of the most beloved operas ever created. What many people don't know is that da Ponte eventually moved to America, where he lived long enough to be photographed in his final years. A daguerreotype taken around 1840, shortly before da Ponte's death at age 91, shows an elderly man with a deeply lined face, the actual visage of someone who had collaborated with Mozart more than half a century earlier. This creates an astonishing connection between the classical music world of 18th century Vienna and the early days of photography in America. Da Ponte's life reads like an improbable novel. Born Jewish in the Republic of Venice, he converted to Catholicism and became a priest, only to be banished for scandalous behavior. After writing his famous libretti in Vienna, he moved through various European cities before eventually settling in New York, where he became the first professor of Italian literature at Columbia College and introduced opera to American audiences. Photography's honest documentation reveals something no painted portrait could convey: the physical toll of da Ponte's extraordinary, tumultuous life across 3 countries and nearly a century. The deeply lined face and frail appearance captured in the daguerreotype testify to decades of reinvention, struggle, and ultimately a pioneering cultural impact in his adopted American home. What makes this photograph particularly remarkable is how it collapses time and space, creating a direct visual connection to the world of Mozart, Casanova, whom da Ponte knew personally, and Emperor Joseph II of Austria. The elderly man in this American daguerreotype had moved in the highest artistic and aristocratic circles of 18th century Europe. When we look at this image, we're seeing seeing a direct link to the creation of some of classical music's greatest masterpieces, the actual face of the man who crafted the words that Mozart set to music. This photograph doesn't just document an extremely elderly individual, it creates a bridge across time to the classical era of European music and its transplantation to the New World. 14. Joseph Niepce, the inventor who captured time. Joseph Niepce, born in 1765, created what is considered the world's first permanent photograph in 1826 or 1827, his famous View from the Window at Le Gras. What many people don't realize is that Niepce himself was later photographed using the improved daguerreotype process developed by his partner Louis Daguerre, creating a fascinating circular connection between the inventor and his invention. The daguerreotype of Niepce, taken in the late 1830s shortly before his death, shows an elderly man with white hair and the formal attire typical of his era. What makes this image particularly remarkable is its meta-historical significance. The inventor of photography himself, captured by the improved photographic process he helped pioneer. Niepce's original photographic process, which he called heliography, required exposure times of 8 hours or more, making it impractical for portraiture. The later daguerreotype process reduced exposure times significantly, allowing Niepce to experience being the subject of the technology he had helped create. Photography's democratic nature ensured that even its inventor would be documented in exactly the same way as other subjects, the camera capturing his appearance with the same mechanical objectivity he had sought to achieve in his own experiments. Unlike painters, who might have depicted Niepce with symbolic elements highlighting his achievement, the photograph shows simply the man himself. What makes Niepce's photograph especially significant is how it represents the rapid evolution of the technology he pioneered. Just a decade separated his grainy, barely recognizable View from the Window at Le Gras from the relatively clear daguerreotype portrait of its creator, a testament to how quickly photography developed once its basic principles were established. When we look at this daguerreotype, we're seeing the actual face of the man who first fixed time through photography, whose experiments capturing light on chemically treated surfaces would transform how humanity documents itself and remembers its past. This image doesn't just show a historical figure, it represents the moment when the creator became the subject of his own creation. 15. Joseph Brant, Thayendanegea, the Mohawk leader's forgotten descendant. While Joseph Brant himself, the influential Mohawk leader who died in 1807, was never photographed, his direct descendant and namesake, Joseph Brant III, was captured in daguerreotypes in the 1840s. These photographs create a remarkable connection to the original Brant, who played a crucial role in the American Revolution and shaped relations between Native Americans and European settlers. The daguerreotypes show a man of mixed Mohawk and European ancestry, dressed in Western clothing typical of the mid-19th century. What makes these images particularly significant is how they document the changing circumstances of the Mohawk people in the decades following the elder Brant's death, the visual evidence of cultural and social transformations that were reshaping Native American life. The original Joseph Brant had been educated in colonial schools, translated the Bible into Mohawk, and allied his people with the British during the American Revolution. After the war, he led his people to lands in Canada, granted by the British Crown, where they established what is now the Six Nations Reserve. The younger Brant, captured by photography, lived in this community established by his famous ancestor. Photography's unbiased documentation reveals something often missing from the romanticized or demonized depictions of Native Americans common in 19th century art. The complex reality of indigenous people navigating between traditional cultures and the rapidly expanding Euro-American society around them. The younger Brant's Western clothing and demeanor in these photographs reflect the cultural adaptations many Native Americans made during this period. What makes these photographs especially valuable is how they counter the vanishing Indian narrative popular in 19th century America, the idea that indigenous peoples were disappearing and would soon exist only in memory. The images of the younger Brant provide visual evidence of Native American continuity and adaptation rather than disappearance. When we look at these daguerreotypes, we're seeing a direct familial connection to one of the most influential Native American leaders of the Revolutionary era, a visual link to the complex diplomatic and military struggles that shaped North America. These images remind us that history doesn't end with famous figures, but continues through their descendants and the communities they helped create. Now, here's what most people don't understand about these remarkable photographs. They don't just show us what historical figures looked like. They fundamentally change our relationship with history itself. Before photography, historical figures were mediated through artistic interpretation. Painters could heroize, flatter, or alter subjects according to contemporary standards or political needs. But photography introduced something revolutionary: unmediated visual truth. The camera captured subjects with a mechanical objectivity that was unprecedented. It documented blemishes, wrinkles, awkward expressions, and imperfect features that painters would have smoothed away. It showed historical figures as they actually were, not as they wished to be seen or as others wanted to present them. This shift from idealization to documentation represents one of the most profound changes in how humans understand their past. What makes these particular photographs especially powerful is that they capture people who lived most of their lives before this technological revolution. They are bridge figures who existed primarily in the pre-photographic world of artistic interpretation, but just barely survived into the age of mechanical reproduction. When we look at Conrad Heyer's weathered face or the Duchess of Bourbon's aged visage, we're not just seeing interesting historical curiosities, we're witnessing the moment when history itself transformed from artistic creation to documented reality. We began by asking what happens when we look at the authentic faces of history's most influential figures rather than artistic interpretations. What we've discovered through these 16 remarkable photographs is nothing less than a transformation in how we connect to our past. These images create direct visual bridges to historical periods that might otherwise feel impossibly remote. When we look at a daguerreotype of someone born in the 1740s or 1750s, we're seeing across more than 270 years of history without the mediating influence of an artist's interpretation. The elderly faces captured by early cameras bear witness to extraordinary historical transformations, from monarchy to democracy, from colonial outposts to independent nations, from handcraft to industrial production. The technology that preserved these faces was itself revolutionary. Photography democratized visual memory, eventually making it possible for ordinary people, not just the wealthy and powerful, to preserve their appearance for future generations. These early photographs of historical figures represent the beginning of our modern visual relationship with the past, a relationship based on documentation rather than artistic recreation. Perhaps most poignantly, these photographs remind us of the humanity of historical figures who might otherwise remain abstract or idealized in our imagination. The camera captures not just their appearance, but hints of their personality, the set of their mouth, the look in their eyes, the way they hold themselves. These details connect us to them as fellow humans across the span of time. As we close our exploration of these historical figures who lived just long enough to be photographed, take a moment to appreciate the remarkable technology that allows us to look directly into the eyes of people born nearly 3 centuries ago and the unique historical circumstances that made these visual time capsules possible. In a very real sense, these photographs collapse time, bringing the past into our present in ways that preceding generations could only have dreamed of. They remind us that history is not an abstraction, but the story of real people who lived, struggled, and changed the world in ways that continue to shape our lives today. If you enjoyed this journey through photographic history, don't forget to hit that like button, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more content exploring the fascinating hidden connections to our past. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below about which of these historical figures surprised you most, or if you know of other remarkable early photographs we should feature in future videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in part 3 of our exploration of history's most astonishing photographs.